Is started and you guys are all on record. And please have at it, Chris.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I think I know almost all of you that are on today. If not, and you don't know me by name or by face, this is me. I tend to remember people by cars that they drive more often than names and faces. So if you've seen either my silver E46 M3 or the white M3 out at track, that is me. That bottom picture was actually taken at a Ferrari Club track day last year, leading a lady around in her Ghibli doing lead follow. And I've done lead follow for actually longer than COVID. I've been doing lead follow with HOD and the BMW Club for intermediate and advanced students for a couple of years, actually. So I've probably got north of 30 to 40 track days doing lead follow, including 5 already this year. So I do a lot of track days per year as a coach. A few of the things that I'm going to talk about, just kind of setting up background of lead follow for the instructor, getting you used to the idea of not being in the car with your students as you're going around the track. We're also going to kind of talk about how to introduce lead follow to those students or clients and explaining expectations because it is slightly different if you're in the car with them. And then also going through some best practices, things that either I've learned personally, other clubs do, or even things pulled from the Ross Bentley lead follow seminar that he's done a couple months ago, or actually it's been long.
Well, isn't that just convenient? Chris just dropped on us like that. Chris, hey, we just cut out there for a moment. I didn't catch what you just said there.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So for lead follow for instructors and coaches, really what we're talking about for this presentation and for today is how we're handling instruction during COVID. So right now we're almost at the transition period where in-car instruction might be coming back. And in fact, I did run right seat with a student at Hooked on Driving at PIR this past Sunday because he was fully vaccinated. I was mostly vaccinated. We had windows down, helmets on, face masks on under helmets. And because his coach's car had a mechanical, my car was almost out of gas. And so to keep him going through the last session, I just hopped in his car with him. That's obviously done right now as an emergency procedure. And Brett will have, the thumbs up and thumbs down if we're allowed to do that at some point this year through PIR. Post-COVID, or even before COVID, it can be a really good tool to have in addition to right seat time. Having instructed students and coach students at all levels from novice through advanced. I think novice really is hard to do in some cases with lead follow, and it is better suited for those first timers to be in the car with them. But as that student progresses up through, the rank, so to speak, of the various clubs that they run with, I think lead follow is a good tool to have. For some customers and some students, it will work well, some better than others. There's obviously challenges with it that we're going to kind of go through. But it is a good tool to have in the toolbox in the context of adding those tools to your toolbox to use. And whenever we're doing lead follow, the priorities are the same. Number one priority is always safety. Education and fun comes secondary to that. So as we talk through some of the best practices that we have for doing lead follow, always keep safety in mind. And I would argue that doing lead follow safely is harder than doing right seat instruction safely, because there's a lot more nuance of things you're going to have to be aware of when you're actually leading a student around the track, especially if it's their first time. And no, we probably don't have to say this for anybody who's on the phone, because I think everybody here has instruction experience, but leading your student around is not the opportunity for you to show off. Kind of goes without saying, but just always good to put it in writing that we want to make sure that we are a safe mentor and a safe demonstrator of what we're asking the student to do when we're actually circulating around the racetrack. So while I did say that lead follow has advantages, and there are a lot of them, there's also some challenges that we have to consider when we do lead follow with students. The first and foremost is probably the big question that folks have if you've never done lead follow before, is how do we communicate between the cars? That's the number one challenge. Even if you have a car-to-car communication system, which I'll talk about, and I'll even show you mine and what most people use at the end of this. There is hand signals that have been standardized by folks like Ross Bentley and the Motorsport Safety Foundation that a lot of clubs nationwide are using. And so I will have a slide that demonstrates those as well. Speed handling deltas between coach and client or student cars is huge. It can be challenging because, 5/10 in a 911 turbo is going to be a lot different than 5/10 in a spec Miata. That's probably the widest example of car pairings we would have. Typically, Brett will obviously try to assign like-minded platforms to each other. So me driving M3s, I tend to get, the mid to high power rear wheel drive cars. Spec Miata guys are going to get lower horsepower momentum cars, etc. But it is something to consider as we're doing lead follow. Another challenge is obviously lead follow means for every student, there's going to be an extra car on track. So that means we have to cap the limit of students that we have for the novice run groups, which obviously impacts our ability to expand that client base and folks getting into the hobby, as some other folks have already mentioned this morning. And another huge challenge that we're going to spend some time discussing is passing for novices, because when we do lead follow, there's always 4 cars involved in a pass. So we don't want students and coaches to get separated on track. So we're going to go through kind of how that has been working for other clubs and even for Cascade last year when we did the 1-day under lead follow conditions. And if there's any questions on that, we can talk through it as we get kind of towards the best practices section. And then also, as a few folks have mentioned during lead follow concerns, you don't really have any visibility into what the student is doing. So hand positions, how smooth they are with their inputs, if they're looking ahead, etc., is impossible effectively to do in a lead follow situation. So as we start talking about these items, these are just some of the challenges that you want to be thinking about and how you're going to handle these and approach these with your clients when you actually get on track with them.
Hey, Chris, I want to add in one additional challenge is not covered here that is just inherent and should be understood. And that is your own car prep is another challenge.
Yes.
Making sure that your car is there to be on track, driving at whatever pace that you feel comfortable with your student. You've got fuel, tires, brakes, fluids are all good. Nothing's falling apart. Nothing's wobbly. So making sure your own car is track worthy for being on track that day. Because you're doing more than just, of course, the lunchtime session. Now you've got all 4 novice sessions you're going to be out there with. So make sure you come prepared for that. And one thing that was brought up to me that I should have done last year and apologize, I didn't for the August school where we did lead follow, but for this year, I am going to try to come prepared. Although I have to admit that I'm only now remembering to come prepared for Friday, so hopefully I get enough time to do this, with some gift cards to compensate for gas or whatever you may want to use. I may be providing prepaid credit cards or gas station cards, one or the other, to help compensate all the instructors for doing the lead follow stuff. So that'll be coming. If I don't have them for this Friday, then they'll come after the fact, but I will definitely owe you guys that. But please make sure your own car is ready to be on track all day. So that's all I have to say. Thank you, Chris. Go on.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. I didn't mention that farther on, but the one thing that I forgot, actually, my first coaching day this year, which was actually up at the Ridge, the third session out after it was getting hot in the day, I completely overheated my tires because I forgot coming off track to actually check my own car because I was so busy helping my student with the debriefs and everything that I forgot to check my own tire pressures and things of that nature that if I was driving solo, I would remember to do. So always keep an eye on your own car throughout the day since you are going to be driving it along track with your student. So how do we actually introduce students to lead follow? And a lot of this is also going to tie into what Charles mentioned about, having that instructor or that reach out to your student, which hopefully you'll be able to do before Friday. If not, part of that Friday morning meet and greet that you're going to have with your student is setting that expectation of what that lead follow is going to look like and the speeds that we're going to have, following distance, just kind of set the expectations of what you were expecting from your student as they follow you around the racetrack, and then maybe later in the day as they lead you around the racetrack. Coordinate getting to pre-grid with your student already paired up. So this is something that every club that I've coached lead follow with has struggled with at the start of the season, which is especially for Cascade, since we pre-grid everybody all at once in the morning into the discrete run lanes. Try to get for that very first on-track session, either next to your student on grid, so that you can tell the corner workers that you're the coach and need to slot in before them, or coordinate getting the cars moved into line so that you're already nose to tail with your student before that first session. It'll make that process run smoother, getting the cars out on track, and so that we don't have a delay or folks kind of messing around in the hot pits. Always test that car-to-car communications before your first session. That also means going out or not going out, but also means going through the hand signals that you're going to use. I generally always do that in the mornings, and then I also do it before our first on-track session. So as we're sitting in pre-grid, I will quickly run through, or as we're making our way to our cars, if we're not doing car-to-car communication, always run through what the hand signals are before every session so that it's fresh in their minds as we actually go out on track. If communications fail, typically the standard is that you're going to use your headlights to signal that there's an issue of some kind, or to get the car in front of you's attention. So that's going to be, if you're leading your student, you want to instruct your student that if there's some kind of issue, they're going to flash their headlights at you to get your attention. And then you're going to either wave or tap your mirror to acknowledge that you see it. And then if the student is leading you, if you need to get the student's attention, the same thing would apply. So again, just go over that with your students at the start of the day and remind them of those quick points, just in case something happens if you are using car-to-car communications. As far as the hand signals go, so some of you may have seen these before. These are the hand signals that Ross Bentley and the Motorsport Safety Foundation have kind of standardized for doing lead follow. These came out at the start of last year when COVID restrictions were really tight and a lot of people moved to lead follow only. So the first one, a roof tap, which is just tapping the roof of your car like this, when you're on track with your student, is just a reminder to have them follow you closely or close up the gap. For lead follow to work, students really have to be at a decently close distance to you to see where you're placing the car and what your line is going to be. So a roof tap just means, hey, get closer to me, or make sure you're paying attention to where I'm placing the car. A finger twirl and or helicopter up in the air signals that you want to exchange places with the student on track. So generally, for most of the other clubs that we also do lead follow with, we don't generally let the student lead until after lunch. And if so, it's only going to be for half the session, with the idea being that they're learning the track and the lines and how to manage traffic and passing for the first half of the day. And then after lunch, we can start letting the student lead us around so we can watch their lines and they can see what it feels like to be out front. The switch positions would immediately be followed by a point by. So if we were leading and we didn't have car-to-car communication, or even if we did, we would still do the gesture. Make sure that the student sees what it is, and then once they acknowledge it, typically with a flash of the headlights, then at that point we would give them our standard point by, out and over or to the left on the back straight, to switch positions. An open hand out the window. Usually in this context, we're going to say to back off or increase the gap. The student's getting a little too close to us. We want to have at least a little bit more gap in between us, just for safety's sake, because again, safety is number one. And then finally, pointing down is what we want to do if we want the student to place the car where we're pointing. I will also use this even with my communications gear if I'm talking to the student verbally, because I've got bright red driving gloves, and it's a very good opportunity to point out where our turn-in cones are, our apex cones are, and our exit cones are. I will also use that on the out laps to denote, and just for the hand signal, where the main turn stations are at as well, just like you would do if you're in the car with the student. And always, it's a good practice just to review the hand signals when you're in pre-grid with your students before every session. And since we generally will be in the car, hopefully 5 minutes before we're actually released on track, I will sit there and talk to my student and go through the hand signals so they can see what I'm talking about, and so that it's fresh in everybody's brains. These are the primary ones that we're going to use. And obviously the one I didn't put in here is the standard fist out the window for coming off track as you come through turn 12. Everybody hopefully should be familiar with that already. So with that being said, I'm going to pause because this is important, especially if you don't have car-to-car communication set up. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or want to discuss the hand signals that we're going to use? No? No questions?
Take that as everybody's now experts in lead follow hand signels.
Well, Steve, I got a question.
Yep.
Okay, Chris, the pointing, not that I'm probably going to be participating in my car, but anyway, I want to know how this works. But the pointing down thing, you say, place car here, turn in apex track out. So every time you're going by a turn-in cone, are you pointing and then you're pointing again at an apex cone, and then are you doing this?
Not every time. Typically what I will do is I will tell the student, and again, if we have comms, I'll be talking to the student as well. But if we don't have car-to-car communications, then what I will tell the student is that for the first session, and especially the first maybe 2 laps, i.e. your reconnaissance laps, which are usually under yellow anyway, especially for the first session of the day, you're going to tell them that I'm going to be pointing out those markers that Brett's talked about in the classroom, i.e. where the turn-in cone is going to be, the apex cone and the exit cone. If for any, I don't want to be doing that every session, especially as the speeds increase. Because 1, they're probably not going to be paying attention, and 2, we want to make sure that we have good control of our own car as the speeds get faster throughout the day into things like the turn-in points. If, for example, I'm letting the student lead and then I want to lead them back around at the end of the day, and because they're missing a turn-in point constantly, then I will just do that gesture so that they actually see what I'm referring to based on our last download session. So I would not expect that you'd be doing it every single lap. It's more just for that first few laps of every session to make sure that they're remembering where those markers are for the school line that we're going to be teaching them.
All right, Charles?
Yeah, so the one thing that I just reiterate, and it's exactly having to do with what Chris just described, is you need to, your student especially, to understand the difference between the pointing down as versus, because it's in single finger, and differentiate between that and a point by, which is the reason why we always want it pointing down. In other words, they don't want to mistake it for a point by.
Yep.
Okay.
That's a good point.
Garrett?
Yeah, that's something I struggle with, Charles, is that pointing versus pointing by, and particularly with the turn stations. I'm normally trying to, communicate that the turn stations are there, and I want to point at it, which is, pointing left and right is a lot like point by. So just never point unless you're pointing by, I guess, is the rule.
I think
Yep.
one suggestion because I think this question came up in preparation for last August. And I think the consensus we had then amongst the instructors was if you wanted to point out your window to like a turn station or something higher up, instead of pointing full hand, like I'm doing,
Yep.
The open palm, using that to point as the universal international non-offensive way of indicating, there's where your interest should be focusing at, right? As opposed to single point with a finger, which now suddenly hides in my virtual background. Anyways, yeah, so you get that idea. Hopefully, maybe that'll help make that distinction. You can also talk to your student beforehand saying, if I'm going to point at something higher than track surface, I'll be using an open palm to indicate that. If it's open palm out the window, that's back off. And if it's a fist out the window, that's, we're pitting kind of thing. So have them be looking at the actual hand itself and seeing exactly how you're using your hand when making those signals.
Brett, didn't you have the MSF cheat sheet for the hand signals in the welcome packets?
Yes.
Okay.
So students
So
get the same information, the same illustrations, what Chris has shown here. And we'll be sharing this as well with all of the instructors as a file you guys can review offline. Okay, Jacob, I think you were next up. See if I can help unmute you for yourself. No, I can only ask to be unmuted. You're still muted there, buddy. Okay.
Me, Dave. Okay.
Well, Dave, go ahead. Maybe Jacob, maybe you can type yours in the chat window or something, and we can help you there if you can't unmute. So go ahead, Dave.
I just don't understand. There's no point buys when it's lead and follows. It's the helicopter. So why is sticking a hand out the window a problem to point at something?
You may still have a pair of cars coming up behind you that you'll need a point by, another instructor-student combo. So there's always that. Chris, do you want to go into a little more detail about managing passing between groups of people?
Yeah, that's actually next. So
okay.
I'm going to cover that next here if nobody has any other questions on what we just showed.
Let's see here. Dawn, you got your hand up?
Yeah, my question was, are we going to have restricted passing areas on the track at all for the beginning groups, or is it just going to be anywhere there's a point by?
So all HPD sessions are limited to where they can pass in pre-specified passing zones.
Okay.
So for novices, that's going to be front straight, back straight only. And we have cones laid out to indicate the beginning and ending of the zones. For the advanced drivers, they get the additional benefit of passing between 3 and 4. And something that we were going to try to introduce at the Cascade Club level specifically that other organizations already do. We were contemplating adding 6 and 7 passing for the advanced group, specifically for that Sunday time trial HPD group. Not sure yet if I'm going to open that one up for this upcoming Friday or not for advanced people.
Sure.
I kind of wanted to try it smaller to kind of get a better sense of it. But for you guys as instructors and the groups you deal with, you're going to be limited to front, back straight. Intermediate might get turns 3 and 4 later on, but the schedule indicates where they're at and when they become available. Let's see here. So Jacob, have you figured out your issue? Yeah, you're off mute. There you go. Go ahead.
How's the morning track drive going to go? Like where we drove the students' cars and talked to them and whatnot. I know we're not going to do that, but how's that going to work?
We still have a recon session. It would still be lead follow. It'd still be low speed, 35 miles an hour. Your intent is to point out key static things. What are the manned turn stations, or what I should say, what are the staffed turn stations?
Right.
You would point out cones and things like that. And before you even go out and track, you explain to them what you're going to be highlighting. You know, that you're going to be placing your car on line, and that's the line they should be following exactly as they go around the track. You're going to use the hand signal, the open palm. You're going to point to all the staff turn stations that are currently working today. And you might use that finger pointing down. Here's a turn-in point. Here's a break point, things like that. But like I said, it'd be best if you're not using in-car communication, or excuse me, between car communication, that's a Bluetooth headset or something, that you have an agreement with them beforehand of what you're going to point out. So they already have some idea of why you're frantically waving your hands out the window during the recon laps.
Is there a don't hit me hand signal?
What's that?
Is there a don't hit me hand signal?
I don't know. Go faster. That'd be the gas pedal.
That's the hand out the window.
Expression.
Yeah.
Okay, that answered my question. Cool.
All right,
Thanks.
thank you. Charles, your virtual hand still up? Do you have anything, or just tired?
I think I have just a quick explanation for Dave's point. And Dave, it is a subtle distinction, but essentially the helicopter is when the student instructor pair are going to change positions, versus a point by is where the entire pair is going to pass another pair of cars. So Chris will get into that, but it is a subtle distinction. But it just, the helicopter is just when if I'm instructing and I've got my students following me, I want to then follow them. And so that's what that little distinction is about.
All right.
Yep. Yeah. So getting into the discussion of passing as we're doing lead follow, probably the most complicated and safety related item when doing lead follow on track with other pairs is how do we handle passing? The big distinction is that we always want the student and coach cars to be together. We never want to split that pod, as we refer them to, up by having somebody else slot in between them. So passing is always going to involve, for novices, 4 cars, the 2 cars being passed and the 2 cars overtaking. So if we have, and I'm going to have a slide that discusses following without comms, but I'm going to start with comms. So when I say comms, we're talking about car-to-car communication with a headset. So I'm going to be managing traffic as the instructor, especially for novices. If it's their first time, I'm not expecting them to be knowing when they're going to have to point somebody by, because chances are they might not even be able to see it if they're leading us around towards later in the day, for example. So I will verbally tell my student as we're getting close to the passing zone that we're going to let 2 cars go by. Once we reach the start of the passing zone, I'll tell my student to initiate the point by, which at PIR again is going to be hand up over the roof to the right, and on the back straight, it's going to be hand out to the left straight. We're going to initiate the point by just like we would do under normal situations. The only difference is you are not going to pass your student if we're just letting faster traffic go past. You are going to stay behind your student. You're going to initiate a point by to the cars behind you, and you're going to tell your student every time a car goes by. And I actually tell my student too what kind of car it is. It just makes it easier for them, or the color of the car, for example. Like, we're going to let the yellow car go past, or we're going to let the blue car go past. Issue an obvious point by for each car passing. Just like we instruct everybody at the driver's meeting, don't just lazily stick your hand out the window and leave it there, because it's very hard for the people behind you to know if that is for me. Do they see that there's more than one car? If it's a chain of 3 or 4 cars, how many cars am I actually pointing by? So if it's another instructor coach or another instructor and student pair behind us, we're going to do one arm out the window for the first car, back in, and then another arm out the window for that second car, just like we would do under normal circumstances. Usually, because each pass is going to involve at least 4 cars, as the coach, especially for the first 2 sessions of the day where you're going to be leading the student, you need to be mindful of how many people are behind you. If it looks like there's 3 or 4 cars, that means that there's at least 2 or 3 instructor student pairs behind you. It might be easier to just come off track and let the chain go, as opposed to trying to find a big enough window to let a pod of 2 cars go past you, or 3 pods of 6 cars total go past you. Because again, we don't want to separate the student and the coach, especially for the first half of the day when they're first still learning the track. Does that make sense to everybody in terms of how we want to handle that 4 cars involved with passing in the 2 let by areas that we're going to have for novices, which is just the front and back straights? Hopefully. I see a hand.
How's it going to work for, let's say, you're in a slower cars or whatever? Should the people being passed slow down just to make it,
Yep. Normal passing etiquette applies. So like we tell everybody, no matter what run group they're in, breathe off the throttle. Don't hit the brakes. That's generally a bad thing to do, especially on the passing zones. Just ease out of the throttle, maintain a slightly slower pace to give the passing cars a chance to get past. And then as the coach, you may need to verbally tell your student, especially if you're on comms, how much you're going to slow down. If, for example, you're in an M3 like I am, and you're leading around a Camaro and you've got to let 2 Miatas go past. You just need to be mindful of those closing speeds and having enough room in front of you so that those cars can get past.
Right,
and that's where
lap times.
Yep, exactly. And that's where, as a coach, the biggest challenge that I've had doing lead follow is just trying to manage all of this for the student, because you're not just sitting in the right seat, not doing your own inputs, right? So you're driving your own car. You have to maintain the gap to the cars in front of you, maintain the gap to your student, and then also watch for the traffic and make sure that you've got enough space to get clean point bys and passing done without causing a huge conga line. So it is something that's going to be important. And I expect, just like with some of the other clubs that we've done lead follow with, the very first session usually tends to have some sketchy passing or just a really long line of cars. And if that's the case, don't feel bad to just come off track and ask for a gap. Just know that you're going to come off with your student. And so there's always going to be 2 cars involved for whatever you're doing. Other than that, aside from it just being 2 cars every time, the same passing rules and the same passing process that we would normally do under normal conditions would apply. Charles?
I actually think that the pulling them off to do get gap is a very valid exercise that I think the students all should experience no matter what. And you explain it to them by that there's 2 kinds of gaps. You can get a gap either because you're faster or you're slower. So you can tell them how to get the gap in front of you or behind you. And I think it's an extremely valuable teaching tool that I do, whether or not we need the gap or not. I virtually always encourage my students to experience that, the hand in the windshield business of given space. So I'm not shy about asking them to pull off and learn how to do that.
So passing without comms. So if you do not have car-to-car communication with your student, again, we're still going to involve 4 cars every passing maneuver in the novice group. For hand signals, again, this just goes back to at the start of every session before you get in the cars with your students, make sure they understand what hand signals we're going to use throughout the day, especially the difference between the point by gesture and the rotate car gesture that you're going to use just with your student. If the coach is leading, then you're going to perform and start the passing exercise, assuming that there's cars behind you that are going to pass, just like you would under normal conditions. As you approach the passing zone, you're going to ease off throttle and initiate a point by. Your student should see that you're putting your hand out the window in a standard point by maneuver, and that will be their cue to lift off, follow you, and do the same thing for the cars following them. If you are following your student, especially later on in the day where the student's going to be leading, we like to do a flash of the high beams or headlights. Hopefully everybody has those, unless you have a race car that doesn't have them, in which case we'll have to figure out some other method. Wait for the student to confirm that, either by flashing their headlights or waving at you out the window or tapping their mirror. And then you initiate the point by, and they should follow you and do the same. And by follow you, I mean replicate your point by either over the roof or out the window. So the same process, the only difference is you're going to be just using the hand signals, which you need to just verify that your student is comfortable with and understands what they are. If for some reason you are not comfortable doing point bys with 4 cars combined in that process, by all means, just come through hot pits, ask for a gap or to be scrunched up with somebody else or a chain of cars that you get released behind, so that you at least have free track and don't have to worry about it for a few more laps. Any questions about that? Comments, concerns, suggestions? No? Nobody? Everybody's happy?
Yeah, I've got one, Chris. I just want to underscore to make sure our students know the signal for coming off the track. I've had experiences where they're not aware of that until kind of late in the piece. So when we're going through our hand signals, please let's include that as well.
Yeah, and that one actually, I didn't put it in this presentation because, again, that's kind of implied regardless if you're doing lead follow or not. The MSF handout that Brett has in the packet does include that in the hand signals.
Okay.
And again, it's just something that I make sure that my students know. And it's easier if you have comms because you can tell them, hey, we're going to exit after this lap, and
Oh, yeah.
I want you to replicate, my hand signal that I put out the window, etc.
Right.
Yeah.
So a big
Hey,
question.
Chris, pause real quick.
Yeah.
Jacob, you have a question?
How's it going to work? Let's say if one of our students goes off track or something like that, or we do for some crazy reason.
I've got some slides that is going to cover oh shit moments or what to do in an emergency. So we'll get to that.
Thanks.
So a big question that comes up that I've been asked from students and even other coaches that have never done lead follow before is the pace that we're going to set for lead follow. And again, this goes back to, potentially the Spec Miata versus 911 Turbo S pairing that might happen out there on track. So whenever we do lead follow, I pretty much tell my students that we're going to have 3 paces, slow, medium, and moderate. We never do lead follow at a high rate of speed. I have done high rate of speed lead follow for advanced students with other clubs, either with Hooked on Driving or with the BMW club. But again, those are advanced students. And it's because I'm not instructing them, I'm coaching them. I'm helping them eke out that last 1/10 of a second that they're trying to get because they're really chasing lap times. It's not something that I recommend or do with complete novices. You want to make sure that you're leading the student at a pace where you can observe the student in your rearview mirror. When I'm doing lead follow, I drive in my rearview mirror. It takes some practice. And you need to be able to observe what your student is doing behind you while still maintaining that safe visibility forward to watch for flags, to watch for slower traffic, etc. So that is something that may be unfamiliar and takes some getting used to if you've never done lead follow before. We want to make sure that we're driving the school line consistently. And I will admit that this is something that I am sometimes bad at because in my track car, my line differs in a few places than what the school teaches. So even though you may be on slicks or with aero and might take a slightly different line if you were driving solo, we want to make sure that when we're leading students around, we are driving the standard line that we teach as part of the school. We also need to make sure that we're driving at a pace where we can manage the gap to another student coach pair in front of us. If we want to reduce the times we need to actually pass, then managing that gap and pace can be a lot more important than if you were just out there driving by yourself, or if you were in the student's car and it's just a quick one car swap when passing needs to occur. And you also need to manage faster student coach pairs approaching from behind. So I will, in my cars, when I'm doing lead follow, I put my side mirrors out a lot farther than I typically would do, so I can get a better visibility into cars coming out of corners behind us, just so I can help manage that traffic, I should say, as we're circulating. So that's a lot of things that you have to do and drive your own car, in addition to just sitting in the right seat and keeping the student safe as they're driving their own car. And the biggest thing that I stress in terms of safety for doing lead follow is managing the gap, especially into turn 1 or at our first day here into turn 4, since it's non-chicane, and then into turn 10 at PIR at the end of the back straight. I generally will tell the student, especially if we're in a higher horsepower car, that I will tell them when to brake every lap, every session at the end of those straights. Because what I want to do is I want to tell them where I want them to brake, and then I will wait a beat before I'm on my brakes, just to open up a safety gap a little bit in case he misses the braking point, he's not hard on the brakes, or there's brake failure, or whatever the case is. So managing that gap to your student, especially at the ends of the straights, is important just for safety's sake, because we want everybody obviously to go home in the same condition that they arrived. Any questions, comments about that? Suggestions for changes as we go into the first day on Friday? I see some nodding heads that everybody hopefully should be good. Brett's maybe not so good. All right, emergency procedures. Generally, we always want to follow the club's standard emergency procedures. Obviously, that's going to entail for black flags, red flags, etc. I'm not going to go through those because those are going to be the same. If comms are working and there is something wrong that you've got to pit outside of flag conditions, i.e. red flag or black flags, if your car is having issues, if we're like me at the Ridge several weeks ago and you forgot to latch your hood, that happened once. Instruct your student to follow you to the pits, address the issue, and you'll re-enter the track together again as a pod. We'd want to do our best to not separate students and coaches on track. If the comms are not working, reinforcing again, going through that signaling procedure to, if you need to get somebody's attention, whoever is in the rear, flash your high beams at them. And whoever is getting flashed, or headlights on and off if you don't have high beams in your race car, acknowledge it with a hand or tap your mirror so that you know that, yes, I acknowledge your high beams and we're going to do whatever we're going to need to do. At that point, if you need to pit, you can initiate a rotation if there's a passing zone to do so. At PIR, hopefully you should, and then lead the students into the pits and address whatever issue there is. To answer the question, what happens if the student has an off and they spin off and either stall or slow down to such a way that it would be unsafe for you to also slow? If you slow down on track to wait for your student, you have then added yet another incident effectively for cars behind you to deal with. So the only time in theory that you would get separated from your student is if your student has an off, or if you have an off, which hopefully you won't because you're not going to be driving fast enough to have an off. And you don't want to stop on track or become yet another rolling chicane that other faster traffic is going to have to deal with. In that case, you want to instruct your student, if you're on comms, to recover, get back on track, and immediately proceed to the hot pits. You will join them there and you'll regroup. Chances are they're going to get black flagged anyway if that happens. So you're going to end up in the hot pits at the end of that lap anyway. If you do not have comms, this is what you're going to have to talk to your student about before every session. Hey, if you spin, I'm going to continue at a slower pace to not impede traffic. You're going to rejoin the track and come into the pits behind me. Or if the student spins, you're going to come into the pits. The student is going to rejoin and then come off track immediately to rejoin you and probably talk to the stewards and have Brett yell at you. Any questions about that? The idea is that this is the only time that you would be separated from your student. And again, because we don't want to turn one car being an impediment to traffic to two cars being an impediment to traffic. Everybody good? Hopefully.
Jacob?
Go ahead.
Hence the pointing to the turn stations and beating that into their heads too.
Yep.
Because they're not looking at a turn station. They just pull back on track and they don't see somebody coming. No, that's going to be Brett yelling even louder.
I think in the 5 days I've done this year already, which have all been at the Ridge and then 2 days of PIR this past weekend, I've only had an issue once with this, and it was my fault because I didn't latch my hood after a session. And going down the back straight at PIR, I saw my hood fluttering, and I instructed my student that we're going to roll through the pits really quick. I hopped out, fixed it, and then we just rejoined the track again.
Yep, been there, done that one.
And again, confirm, the emergency procedures before every session. And it doesn't have to be a long drawn out thing. Just, hey, if you spin, don't panic, safely rejoin, immediately exit the track. And we'll regroup in the pits, even if it means ending the session early to see what happened. And another thing, which I forgot because I missed that last bullet point, if for some reason you and your student get separated, just tell them that if there's more than 1 or 2 cars between you, just come in to the hot pits, and then you can regroup in the hot pits. In theory, that shouldn't happen since we do not have solo novice students in this group. Everybody's going to be paired up with a coach and instructor, so you shouldn't have somebody splitting you. But just in case it happens, that's going to be the procedure. It makes it a lot easier than trying to regroup on track through passing, because there may not be enough opportunities to get together again before the end of the session.
Just quickly, students are going to be briefed before the day on how to safely rejoin the track.
That should be part of the driver's meeting
Okay.
that Charles is going to run in the morning.
Right.
And also probably Brett, are you going to cover that in the classroom the day before?
Yeah, I will try to remember to do that.
Yeah.
But don't necessarily count on that, because one thing that really kind of just hit me as I was listening to Chris talk, a terminology thing. We talk about exiting the track. We all know what that means. Some people actually do get kind of confused and think they actually need to leave the facility as a whole as exiting the track. So make sure you clarify and set that expectation what that means, where they actually exit and how that works. So
We actually had the car will remain nameless, but up at HOD, the first session we had, their first coaching day we had up there at the Ridge, a novice solo student who runs in the solo group but was novice or solo approved, because HOD does that, missed so many black flags that when the session was finally stopped to get them off track, they literally just drove and left. So don't be that person. They didn't even stop. They literally just drove right off track and left and never came back. So yeah, a few miscellaneous items. Hopefully helpful, I should say, to remind students where to brake and tell them where to brake at the end of the straights. For me, especially if I'm in my street car, it's a safety issue. If I'm with somebody that's in a very heavy car like my own, a street, M3, Camaro, whatever the case is, I want to have just a little bit of extra space into those really heavy braking zones, just for peace of mind. And then I'll wait a beat and then be on the brakes myself. And then if I'm confident with the student towards the end of the day, I'll tell them that I'll be telling them when to brake, when I'm going to brake, so that they can see where I'm braking and coming off the brakes as they're learning how to manage their own braking zones.
I'm going to inject in here real quick, Chris. I like the idea of waiting half a beat or so to kind of give yourself a little bit of extra safety margin there. But take that gap there into account on where you want to initiate your braking. For the majority of folks who are going to be instructing with us in Cascade, don't necessarily have the benefit of the Bluetooth Sena headset that Chris has been talking about with the car-to-car communication. So if you're running without a verbal communication system and you're relying entirely on non-verbal commands for the lead follow stuff, your brake lights are really good indication of where you want them to brake. So if you want them to brake at the 500 marker, yet you want to offer up a buffer there, you need to make sure you plan accordingly and that sort of stuff. So
very good point.
Yeah.
And I would, if I didn't have car-to-car comms, then I would probably tell the student, watch for my brake lights. That's where I'm going to want you to brake. And what I would do in my car, which is not going to be really visible to them, is I would do light braking to get my lights on, where they're going to be hard on the brakes. And then I would brake a little bit harder immediately after that. And again, that's just to manage that gap as best we can.
And I would extend this to the morning recon laps when you're doing lead follow there. Even though you're going very slow, I think it might be in your best interest to help coach them and saying, part of what we're going to do in the recon laps is I'm going to be indicating with my brake lights where I expect us to be initiating or braking for our first couple sessions in the morning. And you use that to kind of start drilling in that consistency with them. Take that as a grain of salt, that may work for you, that may not. Just add that to your toolbox and have a discussion with them if that's something you're going to do.
Yep. So I know I've mentioned it already in some of the other slides, but do your best to drive that school line. So, if you're in a race car and are running slicks or very sticky tires or aero, and you might pinch off that first apex where we normally have students take the wider line, make sure you're driving the line that we're instructing the novices. Normally, if you trail brake in a T1 like I do, where I extend that braking zone all the way from turn in to basically the turn 2 entry, I want to make sure that I'm not doing what I would normally do driving by myself at 10/10ths. And I want to make sure that I'm showing students that we want all the braking done in a straight line, get the car neutral for the turn in, etc. So just keep that in mind, because I know that when I get in my track car, my brain switches into drive the nuts off it mode. And I sometimes forget that I've got to drive the line that we're teaching students as a novice.
Don, you have a question?
Yeah, so if it's raining out there Friday or wet, do we do sort of a rain line, or are we just going to go on the same line just regardless of what happens?
I would teach the rain line that I drive. So at PIR, there's a few places where you don't want to be on the dry racing line in the wet. The front straight in particular, because it pools water right next to the wall.
Yeah.
So the dry line is kind of more 3/4 to center track, where it's crowned and it's fairly dry. And then turn 4 apex, there is also a puddle there on the right-hand side, right at the rumble strip. So I will stay about a foot off that in the wet. I think everywhere else, the dry line is pretty much the normal line. But those are the two big areas. When we're not running the chicane. If we're running the chicane, then turn 2 and 3 can get a little squirrely due to the surface transitions.
So we're not going to go way off the line, just a little bit off.
Yep.
For puddles and so forth. Okay, that's good.
There's one other area that I would personally add, because I've found to be kind of sketchy, and that's roughly around the turn 8 apex where the Porsche bump used to be. When it's really wet, I tend to try to straighten that whole thing out, and I tend to breathe on the throttle a little bit, especially with a higher horsepower rear-wheel drive kind of thing. I've had cars get kind of sketchy there, and I've seen people bend their cars in the wall there too.
Yeah, that's a notorious one.
Yeah.
I went for a skate with a guy, an experienced driver. We instructed him to breathe on and be very gentle on the throttle. Yeah, it didn't happen, and we put it in the wall. But I had another student. I told him the exact same story. High horsepower car, and fortunately he had the nannies on, and it caught the car, and he was, probably had to change his pants. But that is very, very dangerous in the wet for high horsepower cars.
Yep.
You gotta be really careful through there.
And just, I don't have slides about this. So that was the end of the slide portion of what I was going to talk about. But really briefly, if anybody does not have a car-to-car system and would like to purchase one, I've been using these since even before COVID. Since I started coaching, even in car, I use these instead of just relying on shouting or the wired systems, because I didn't like having wires between us and then have to hold something in the car, like the TrackCom systems or whatnot. So these are what I use, and what a lot of instructors with HOD and BMW Club use. So these are actually made for motorcyclists. They got about a half-mile range, and you can actually pair up to 5 of them together. I've never had to pair more than one, but there you go. So they're about $150 for a one, and then you can get a dual setup to get started with on Amazon for $270. Kind of expensive. What I do is I've then bought for an extra $50 a couple more of the base plates, which are these things. So if I have 2 students in a day, I have 2 base plates I attach to both student helmets, and then the transmitter, which is the expensive part, I literally just take off the helmet, put on the next one, turn it on, and we're off. And so it works really well. You can pair these with different models of the Sennas, but this is what a lot of the coaches are using.
And as far as the base plates, I think they're just like a screw clamp on fixture. Yep. They're not like an adhesive sticker or anything like that. So
I don't know if you guys can see it,
off.
But there's 2 Allen keys on the back, and you basically just loosen those up, and then there's a plate, and I actually brought my helmet over so you can see when it's attached. It just attaches to the side, and then the actual earpieces inside have a little bit of Velcro on them, so they just kind of stick to the padding inside the helmet. And then there's a microphone in there and all that good stuff. So they're kind of expensive, but again, they work really, really well. And I love them in car as well, because then we don't have to shout and we don't have wires going between us. It just makes life a little bit easier, especially if we need to swap positions, which we don't do at Hooked on or at Cascade, but for other clubs, when we sometimes drive student cars, it makes it easier to switch driver and passenger if we're doing that. So they're available on Amazon. I threw that up there if you guys want to just write it down, the brand, if you're interested in purchasing those for lead follow. It's a good tool to have. I really love them. So I'm going to continue using them even after we go back to in-car stuff.
Ryan.
One thing that I use on my motorcycle helmets, kind of like that, but it's the Cardo system. And it doesn't require any tools in order to clip the base plates on. So you can just push it on the bottom of the helmet. Makes it really easy just to pull off, move to the next one, stuff like that if you need to. So
okay.
Another one is the Cardo system.
Yeah, and I don't really use an Allen key either. I just use my fingers, and that's usually enough to get it tightened on there to stay. So, and again, like the base plates are, I think, $49. So I've got 3 sets in case one walks off. But if I have 2 students in a day, I can just put them on in the morning and just swap the transmitter back and forth, because the transmitter is the expensive piece. But yeah, there's lots of options out there. And most of them, especially the Senna line, they have a lot of different versions, and they're all interchangeable as far as pairing. They're not interchangeable as far as transmitters and base plates, but you can at least pair different models together.
Okay, Ryan, Cardo, C-A-R-D-O, is that what you're talking about?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. All right, so everybody comfortable with this? Is there anybody not comfortable and really should be speaking up and asking questions and has been reluctant because they feel like they're wasting everybody's time? Please don't feel that way. Ask your question. Let's get you comfortable with this.
Yeah, and I'm more than happy to talk with anybody on Friday as well. I've done lead follow again for several years outside of COVID, and I mean, last year I did 15 track days, and this year I'm going to do 25 or 30. So I've done it a lot. So if anybody needs any questions answered or just wants to chat about the best way to handle something, come find me. And
I see Matt has a question, so please feel free.
Sure. For the sake of the recording, there's been a side conversation going in the chat about how feasible it is to use cell phone based headset communication. And just a quick comment on that, Chris.
I've known that some people have tried it, or even just use like their Apple earbuds in their helmet and just call your student on your phone. I've had some instructors try that, like with Hooked on Driving, and it's worked okay. It really depends on it. At PIR, it's easier because we have cell reception. At other tracks like ORP or the Ridge, where you don't have cell reception, it's not really possible. With PIR, it can work. So if you can try that with your student, and if they're in a newer car and you're in a newer car that has hands-free, by all means try it. Just note that you might have some issues hearing based on the windows being open and all that kind of stuff. But if you can figure out a way to make that work with your student, more power to you, because any voice comms is better than none, in my opinion.
Charles?
Yeah, my experience with cell phone at PIR, it didn't work very well. The student was using hands-free and I was using earbuds because my car doesn't have hands-free. They didn't have hands-free in 1974. It didn't work terribly well. There was too much delay, there was too much noise. And ultimately we bailed on it and just went back to just hand signals.
Yep, thank you for bringing that up, Matt, I appreciate that.
Okay.
Anybody else? Questions or comments or concerns? I think we're good then. Okay, thank you, Chris, I appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the